CEO Big Shaq walked into his own bank and got denied a loan. 7 minutes later, silence turned into strategy, and jobs turned into memories. They didn't recognize the empire builder, so the empire reminded them. This isn't just a story, it's a warning. Never forget who signs the checks. What happened next? Let's just say the boss clocked in. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The morning sun touched down on the city like a soft promise, gold brushing the glass skyline of a place that had long forgotten how to listen. Downtown, the traffic hummed with the precision of routine, coffee cups in hands, faces in phones, people chasing time, and yet, amidst the motion of it all, when he walked the sidewalk, the city slowed just slightly, just enough, not out of obligation, out of reverence. Shaquille O'Neal wasn't just a name on headlines or marble plaques. He was a presence, towering not just in height, but in spirit. To some he was Big Shaq, to others, simply Shaq. But for most he was proof that power didn't always corrupt, that wealth didn't always blind, and that kindness could be louder than pride. He didn't walk with an entourage, didn't need to. People greeted him like an old neighbor. He remembered names, birthdays, who had just lost a parent, and who had just had their firstborn. His suits were tailored, yes, but his values were stitched from the ground he came from. He wasn't a man detached from the city. He was the city, its memory, its hope, its contradiction. He had built empires, basketball glory, tech investments, chain businesses, and most notably the bank, a network of branches scattered across the nation, created under the banner of equity. It was his most personal venture, not just a business, but a mission aimed at leveling the playing field, in a system rigged for decades, loans for the overlooked, trust for the distrusted. It was his love letter to the people who looked like him, talked like him, were him before the millions, before the fame. This day wasn't meant to be different. No cameras, no PR events. He had promised his goddaughter, a bright, wide-eyed 16-year-old from East Liberty, that he'd open her a savings account in person. She didn't need him to, but he wanted to. It was a gesture, one of those quiet little things that mattered more than press releases or speeches. Shaq pulled into the lot of one of his branches, not in a Rolls, but in a modest gray truck, with a basketball keychain dangling from the ignition. He wore a navy hoodie and jeans, comfortable, unassuming. Inside, the lobby buzzed with mild activity. Customers at counters, muffled conversation, polite nods, but no one looked twice at him. The receptionist, a thin woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tone, glanced up. Her smile didn't quite reach her pupils. "Can I help you, sir?" Shaq returned the smile, warm and effortless. "Just here to open an account, for a young lady. She'll be here shortly." She nodded, but something in her expression shifted. Suspicion, maybe, or assumption, the kind of thing that never announces itself, but clings. She motioned toward the waiting area, without standing. "You can wait there. We're short-staffed today." He nodded, quietly watching as a sharply dressed man in a blazer strolled in minutes later, and was greeted, like royalty. Champagne tone. Deference. Efficiency. No waiting for him. Shaq sat and waited. No recognition. No urgency. It didn't sting because his ego was bruised. It stung because this was the very system he'd built to end these assumptions, because he could see it like X-ray vision. The way her eyes dismissed him, the way a teller 2 booths over nudged a coworker and made a passing joke he couldn't quite hear, but could feel in his spine. Subtle racism wasn't always loud. It was in the pauses, the refusal to see. Still he waited, and when his goddaughter finally walked in, vibrant in her joy, he stood to greet her, but the receptionist cut in before he could speak. "Sir, please don't approach customers." That was the moment. The shift. He chuckled, gently. "She's with me." But the tension had already bloomed. A manager appeared. The tone sharpened, and before he knew it, he was being asked politely to leave the building and re-enter. When his companion had finished, he didn't shout. He didn't demand his name be Googled. He simply looked at the name tags, Eliza, Thomas, Will, and committed them to memory. Then he whispered something to his goddaughter and walked out, letting the sun claim him again. The door shut behind him like the final line of a bad joke. Outside, the wind carried the distant echo of sirens, a reminder that the city still ran on chaos. But inside Shaq's head, There was only silence, not the kind that comes from stillness, but the kind born of pause, reflection. He sat in his truck, not starting it, not calling anyone, just breathing, processing. This was his bank, his name on the documents, his vision in the mission statement. And yet when he stripped away his fame, his face, his expected performance, they saw nothing worth respecting. He didn't feel anger, not yet. What he felt was deeper, older, a slow-burning reminder that no amount of money could bleach perception. That to some, black excellence was only palatable when it entertained, performed, or donated, but not when it sat quietly in a hoodie, asking for service. As the minutes ticked by, he thought about Lucille, his mother, who used to tell him, "A man's worth ain't in what he builds, but what he allows to be built in his name." He looked back at the building, now aware that rot had crept in through the cracks. He had tried to build a monument of trust, but termites had names and badges, and polite tones. 7 minutes passed before he finally moved. Not out of rage, out of purpose. He tapped his phone and called one number. "Get the boardroom ready." Then he hung up. The city didn't know it yet, but something had shifted. The ground had tilted. The sun still shone, but it now cast longer shadows. What had been dismissed as a minor inconvenience would soon become the trigger for a reckoning. A giant had been denied, not because he wasn't worthy, but because the world still struggled to see giants when they didn't come dressed in armor. And Shaq, Big Shaq, was done waiting to be seen. The mid-morning sun gleamed off the glass facade of the bank, like a polished lie, reflecting everything, revealing nothing. This was one of Big Shaq's flagship branches. Downtown, high-foot traffic, strategically placed between rising tech hubs and legacy law firms. The kind of branch that was designed to project inclusivity, prosperity, trust. The ads in the windows boasted about opportunity for all, faces of color, stock smiles, slogans about equality in bold fonts. But today, none of that mattered. Shaq had deliberately chosen this branch. It wasn't random. He'd heard whispers, not from the media or upper execs, but from the streets, from barbershops and bartenders, that this location treated some folks differently. That if you walked in with brown skin and no business suit, you might leave with a rejection slip instead of respect. He didn't want to believe it, but he didn't want to ignore it either. So he dressed accordingly. No designer coat, no tailored slacks, just gray joggers, a neutral hoodie, and a baseball cap pulled low. Not to hide, he couldn't hide if he tried, but to blend, to test, to see the system not as the man who built it, but as the man it claimed to serve. He parked across the street and walked the rest of the way. As he approached the entrance, the automatic glass doors didn't open immediately. He slowed down, thinking the motion sensor lagged. He stepped forward again, slightly puzzled. Still nothing. It took him a second to realize the security guard inside had locked them manually. He stood with folded arms, narrowing his eyes as he approached. "You got business here?" the guard asked, through the glass. Shaq lifted his chin, tapping lightly on the door. "Yeah." The guard didn't move to open it. He looked him over, not in the eyes, but at his shoes, his build, his hoodie. Then slowly, with a sigh like he was being inconvenienced, he buzzed the door. Shaq entered. The lobby was sleek, dark wood accents, chrome trim, minimalist furniture, and the scent of expensive air freshener. There were 4 customers being served, a few seated in the waiting area, and a receptionist behind the welcome desk. She was young, poised with a headset tucked neatly beneath her blonde bun. She looked up, registered him, and then immediately looked back at her screen without a word. Shaq stood quietly for a moment before stepping closer. "Morning. Looking to speak with someone about a personal loan." The receptionist tapped something. "You have an appointment?" "No. Just walked in." Her fingers stopped moving. "Do you already bank with us?" "Yeah," he said. "For a while now." She looked him over, hoodie cap, plain demeanor, and then gave a strained smile. "All right. I'll check if anyone's available. What's your name?" "Jerome Reed," he said. A name he used sometimes in field operations. No red flags, no fame attached. Just a name like any other. She typed again, then pointed to a laminated clipboard. "Fill this out while you wait." He nodded, took the clipboard and sat, across from him. A young white couple in suits were offered bottled water and ushered directly to an office. Another man in a crisp polo was greeted by name. 23 minutes passed. No one called him. Finally, a loan officer emerged. Slim, confident, with a trimmed beard and the casual arrogance of someone who believed the office was his stage. "Jerome?" he asked, glancing around like he expected someone else to answer. His eyes landed on Shaq, visibly surprised. "Oh, right. Come on back." Dale. Shaq followed him to a narrow glass-walled office. He sat in the guest chair as the loan officer adjusted his keyboard and glanced briefly at the form. "Looking for a personal loan, huh? For what purpose?" "Starting a business. Mobile detailing service." "Credit score?" Shaq didn't blink. "Annual income?" "Just under 80. The officer nodded, entered the numbers, made a face like he smelled something off. "Do you have collateral?" "Some savings. A vehicle." The officer tilted his head. "Look, I'll be real with you. These days banks are tightening up, especially for new small businesses. You'd probably be better off trying a microloan through a nonprofit or something local." Shaq looked at him evenly. "You haven't run the numbers yet. I've seen enough to know what'll likely happen. You're not even pulling the report. It's not personal, man. I'm just saving you time." Shaq nodded slowly, pressing his palms together. "You do this often." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Do what?" "Decide for people before the system does." The officer leaned back, arms folded. "It's called efficiency. Not everyone gets a yes." Shaq stood. "Thanks for your time." He left the office without another word. Walked past the receptionist, who didn't look up. Past the security guard, who still stood like a statue guarding something sacred. Back into the sunlight that now felt harsher than it had an hour ago. Inside the truck he exhaled. Not a sigh. A release. The feeling wasn't new. It wasn't rage either. It was that precise ache that came when you realized something you built, with your name, your vision, your values had stopped reflecting you. Had grown into something else. Something smaller. Something sinister. They hadn't seen him. Not really. They'd seen a hoodie, a guess, a fear. They didn't check the system. Didn't glance at his decades of contributions, or the foundation he chaired, or the homes he'd funded, or the millions he'd circulated back into this very community. They saw a statistic, one they thought they'd learned to spot. Shaq stared at the glass doors. So clean, so reflective, and yet so blind. This wasn't about a loan. It wasn't about respect, either. It was about betrayal. Not by enemies, but by a system wearing his own colors. And it had just spoken, clearly, calmly, confidently. "You don't belong here. Not even in your own house. Not even with your own name." He pulled out his phone, stared at it. He didn't call the PR team, didn't call his assistant, didn't call his legal guy. He just sat, breathing, thinking. The humiliation was quiet. It hadn't made a scene, but it had carved something in him, something permanent. A new kind of war was coming. One not fought in courtrooms or press rooms, but in boardrooms, behind glass doors, where smiles lied and names meant nothing. Shaq would walk back into this same branch again. But next time, the glass door wouldn't lock. It would shatter. The car door clicked shut with a muted finality, like punctuation after a sentence that had been forced out. Shaq sat behind the wheel of his gray pickup, the glass branch visible in the rearview mirror like a haunting reflection he couldn't unsee. There was no music, no voice memo, no call, just silence. The kind that bends time, the kind that feels like it stretches between moments and memories. Shaq leaned back, eyes open, but focused inward. His chest didn't rise in rage, and his fists weren't clenched in fury. What simmered inside him was something older, slower, heavier. Not a flame, a weight. He reached for the worn leather journal in the passenger seat. Not to write, just to hold it. It had been with him since college. Lucille had given it to him with a note written in blue ink on the first page. "The world will see your size before it sees your soul. Never forget to protect both." He had read that line so many times the paper had begun to thin. Now he thought of her again. Lucille. Strong, direct, unfiltered. A woman who could cook, pray, and lecture in the same breath. Often while stirring a pot of gumbo and pointing a wooden spoon. He heard her voice, as clearly as if she sat beside him. "They'll smile in your face until the day you stop shining. Then they'll act like they never saw the light." He let that sink in. Because today, he hadn't shined. He'd hidden the glow on purpose. He'd become the version of himself the world so often overlooked. Quiet, regular, black. Not Big Shaq. Just a man in a hoodie, asking for help. And in those 7 minutes in that building, the mask of diversity slipped, and the raw face of discrimination grinned back at him. The silence deepened. He remembered being 17, sitting in the school gym alone, after a loss, wiping sweat from his forehead when the assistant coach walked by, and muttered, "Too big to miss free throws. Too black to be soft." Back then, he didn't even know what to do with a sentence like that. Now, decades later, he'd heard thousands like it, dressed in different words, but cut from the same cloth. He looked at the dashboard clock. A minute had passed. The second minute came with the memory of his first boardroom meeting. Fresh off retirement, polished suit, business degree in hand. Yet one executive leaned over to another during introductions and whispered, "He's here for branding, not brains." They thought he wouldn't hear. He did. He always did. Minute 3 brought him to Atlanta, years ago, when he tried to buy a building outright in cash. The broker spent 20 minutes explaining how difficult the approval process could be. Shaq had leaned forward and smiled. "Approval? I'm buying it with a check, not asking for a favor." The broker blinked, paused, then smiled too late. By the 4th minute, the ache in his chest wasn't pain, it was purpose. He saw now that the glass door hadn't failed to open because of a technical glitch. It had stayed shut because someone on the inside didn't think he belonged. That's the thing about systemic prejudice. It doesn't need to scream, it just doesn't move when you arrive. 5th minute, he thought of his staff. The countless people he trusted, the policies he'd signed off on, the town halls where he'd preached equity and fairness. What if this wasn't the first time? What if his name had become a shield for others to hide behind, to discriminate without suspicion? That possibility burned. The betrayal of it, that in trying to build a gate for others, he might have been sold a locked one himself. Minute 6 wasn't just memory. It was decision. He flipped open the journal and traced the words of his mother's note. Below it, he'd written something himself years ago. Never fight for position, fight for vision. He hadn't come into the bank for a loan. He'd come to test the vision. And now that vision had cracks. Deep ones. 7th minute. Shaq finally blinked. Slowly. Then he reached for his phone, not like a man calling backup, but like someone dialing judgment. His thumb hovered over one name, Kendrick Palmer. His executive assistant. Loyal. Razor sharp. Always ready. The call rang twice. "Boss," Kendrick answered. Chipper. Unaware. Shaq's voice was even, quiet, controlled. "Pull the internal audits on branch 09D. Customer service logs. Complaints. Staffing profiles. Now." A pause on the line. "Right now?" "Now, Kendrick. No leaks. Just data. And get me a list of everyone who's logged a discrimination complaint in the last 3 years. I want raw files. No summaries." Kendrick didn't ask why. He knew better. "Yes, sir. Anything else?" "Call an emergency board session. Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. Full attendance. No exception." "Understood." Shaq ended the call without a goodbye. The weight didn't lift, but it started to shift. The silence was no longer a vacuum. It was fuel. He started the engine. The glass building behind him remained still, unaware. The staff inside, unaware. But a current had changed direction. The same man they denied a loan to under the name Jerome Reed was about to walk back in under his real one. And this time he wasn't coming as a customer. He was coming as a reckoning. The elevator ride to the top floor was longer than usual. Not in seconds, but in sensation. It felt stretched, deliberate, as if time itself understood something irreversible was about to happen. Shaq stood alone inside the mirrored box, hands clasped in front of him, eyes staring ahead, but seeing much more than a reflection. The glass doors to power were behind him now, figuratively and literally, and ahead lay something far more sobering than a confrontation. It was reckoning. When the elevator doors parted, the energy of the executive floor met him in silence. The open concept workspace, normally filled with brisk footsteps and low conversation, had a strange stillness to it. Word had already traveled through back channels, through side eyes and nervous texts. Shaquille O'Neal had returned early, quietly, and whatever brought him back wasn't scheduled. He didn't stop at his corner office. He walked straight to the boardroom. Kendrick Palmer was already there, standing at the head of the long oak table, a laptop open, his hands hovering above the keyboard. The other executives, some seated, some standing with coffee cups halfway to their lips, paused when they saw Shaq enter. They didn't expect a monologue, but they expected something. They didn't get it. Shaq gave Kendrick a single nod. Kendrick began. Effective immediately, an internal audit has been ordered on Branch 09D. This includes client engagement records, behavioral logs, interview footage, exit reviews, and flagged HR reports from the past 24 months. A murmur rippled across the table. One of the VPs leaned forward. Is there a reason this branch is being targeted? Shaq's voice finally cut the air. Not loud, not emotional, but clear. It's not being targeted. It's being evaluated. The difference is in intention. He walked to the windows lining the far end of the boardroom. From there, the city looked like it bowed to the horizon. Skies scraped, light shifted, yet nothing in that view showed the ugliness that had walked him out of his own bank just hours ago. There was a time, he said without turning, when I used to think my name could protect people, that if I built something with the right values, the right voice, the right purpose, the poison wouldn't find a way in. He turned slowly, letting his gaze move across the room. I was wrong. He sat, folding his hands over the table. The space between each word he spoke was intentional. This morning, I walked into 09D as a regular customer, not as your boss, not as a celebrity, not as a billionaire, as a man looking for a simple service. No one spoke. No one needed to. I was ignored, profiled, denied. No one checked my ID. No one looked me in the eye. No one even opened the door until I was questioned like I was an intruder. I've been denied loans before. I've lost games, but I have never stood in a building I own and felt like I didn't deserve to be there. Someone exhaled, a sound too loud for the room. Shaq's tone didn't shift. This isn't about one branch. It's about a disease. Quiet, spreading, institutional, and the worst part, it wore my name while it worked. Kendrick passed out manila folders, thick with internal memos, transcripts, camera timestamps, employee complaints, long buried, or labeled as inconclusive. As each executive opened theirs, the room changed. Eyes dropped, shoulders tightened, paper shuffling replaced the quiet. But the evidence was irrefutable. You all know I don't swing a hammer unless I'm ready to rebuild, Shaq said. So I'm not here to throw anyone under a bus. I'm here to pull people out from the one that's been rolling for too long. He tapped the table twice, a rhythm that was somehow heavier than a slam. We're making immediate changes. Kendrick stood again and read aloud. Are we issuing a press release? Shaq shook his head. Nope. This isn't a PR move. It's a people move. This happens in silence first. We fix it before we sell it. If we get this right, our story will speak for itself. Another executive, older, a fixture in the company since its inception, leaned back and raised a brow. You're making major moves with no vote. I'm not voting on whether or not racism exists in my company, Shaq replied calmly. We'll vote on the strategy. But the rot, that's non-negotiable. The room fell quiet once more. Outside the boardroom glass, a few junior employees slowed their walk to catch a glimpse of what looked like a meeting, but felt like a verdict. I didn't build this company to be another face on a billboard, Shaq said. I built it to matter, and I'll be damned if it turns into the same machine I promised to disrupt. He stood. Meeting adjourned. As he walked out, the floor buzzed to life again. Footsteps faster, whispers louder, but it wasn't fear he left in his wake. It was accountability. He hadn't shouted, hadn't fired anyone publicly, but something had broken. Not in a way that scattered, but in a way that made space for something new. In his office, Shaq looked at a framed photo of him and Lucille, taken during the ribbon cutting of the first branch. Her smile was big, hand holding his, her eyes bright with pride. He stared at it for a long time. Clean it up, he said softly to himself, the words more vow than instruction. The chain hadn't snapped. It had been unlinked. Silently, strategically, and for the first time in a long time, the company was no longer just a brand. It was a mission back on track. The numbers didn't lie. They never did, and that's what made them so dangerous. Shaq sat alone in his office, the glass walls towering around him, making the skyline feel like it was watching him. The city outside buzzed, oblivious. Inside, his world was tilting in silence. In front of him lay spreadsheets, internal reports, HR evaluations, policy change logs, thousands of entries, none of them dramatic on their own. But when layered together, they told a story darker than denial. A pattern, a decision, a betrayal. For the last 3 nights, he hadn't slept. Not out of anxiety, but disbelief. A kind that crept into his chest slow and cold. Like fog. The quiet racism he experienced at the branch, That had been personal, infuriating. But what he was staring at now was structural, rooted, intentional. It hadn't started yesterday. It had started years ago. Policies buried in updates, language subtly tweaked, risk assessment algorithms recalibrated under the guise of economic efficiency, loan application forms redesigned with added steps that statistically increased drop-off rates, disproportionately among Black and Latino applicants, internal memos from directors, signed and archived, suggesting higher caution with low-wealth zip codes, dressed up in bureaucratic politeness, all of it wrapped in a clean corporate image, all of it under his brand. The sharpest cut wasn't in what they did, it was in what they used. His face had been printed on the brochures. His voice had echoed through training videos about fairness, dignity, inclusion. We don't just bank, we believe. The campaign had gone viral. Awards had followed, magazine covers, panels, applause. But behind the curtain, behind the buzzwords, his name had become a shield, a mask they wore while cutting equity at the knees. He stood, slowly, moving to the edge of his office, where the skyline opened up like a stage. He pressed a hand against the glass, not out of drama, but because he needed to feel something solid, something real. Was this what Lucille meant? They'll smile in your face until the day you stop shining. He thought he had been leading a revolution from the inside. What if instead he'd been the face that let the empire grow quietly ruthless? Was he just another symbol they'd polished until it became marketable? A figurehead with a soft voice, big shoes, and a bigger image, one they could point to whenever questions came too close to the truth. That question sat heavier than any loan denial. It didn't matter how many schools he'd funded, how many community events he'd spoken at, or how many scholarships bore his name. If the very system he'd designed to empower was being used to suppress, then he was part of the machine, even if he hadn't built it that way. A soft knock interrupted the spiral. Kendrick entered, holding a sealed envelope and a tablet. His expression was grim, controlled. "We found it," he said quietly. Shaq turned, not asking what. He knew. The policy change regarding small business loans. It was slipped into a mid-year risk report 3 fiscal cycles ago. It wasn't announced, just updated quietly. The language was cloaked, discretionary flexibility for market-tier managers based on local economic metrics. But when you cross-reference approvals since then, the numbers are stark. He handed over the tablet. On screen was a heat map, green zones, red zones. The red burned through neighborhoods Shaq had grown up around, Black majority areas, Latin communities, every red dot a story, a rejection, a shutdown, a lost chance. And who authorized it? Kendrick hesitated. You signed it. Shaq froze. Kendrick continued, gently. They buried it in the middle of a 68-page document. You weren't supposed to catch it. I traced the draft. It was assembled by Director Raymond Cresswell's team. The language was intentional, deliberate, legal, but misleading. Raymond, a man Shaq had once called a mentor in business. Polished, silver-haired, smooth. The kind who always knew the right words in public, and the sharpest ones in private. Raymond had once told a press conference that Shaq O'Neal brings soul to finance. It had been framed as a compliment. Shaq walked back to the desk, sitting slowly. He opened the sealed envelope. Inside were screenshots, internal emails between Raymond and 2 regional directors. Nothing explicit, but clear enough. He's useful. Just keep him in front of cameras, not policy reviews. We'll handle the real work. As long as he believes the message, the public will too. Optics matter. The page blurred for a second. Not from emotion, but from clarity. Shaq had been used, decorated, displayed, distracted. And all the while, the curtain had stayed closed. Until now. Kendrick, he said slowly, I want a full list of every department head tied to policy shifts over the last 5 years. Anyone who touched that language. Anyone who reviewed and passed it along. I want their tenure logs, their correspondence, their hiring decisions. All of it. Kendrick nodded. Already started. And one more thing. I want the diversity team dissolved. Kendrick blinked. Wait, what? That team was built to perform, Shaq cut in, not to protect. I read their metrics. They track how many photos we use of smiling brown faces, not how many we serve. They build optics, not outcomes. They're a PR unit with a heart-shaped logo. That's not change. That's camouflage. Kendrick's nod was slower this time. Resigned. Then he asked the question Shaq hadn't yet said aloud. What are you going to do? Shaq looked out the window again. The city kept moving. Horns, wind, life, as if nothing had happened. But for him, something had shifted permanently. I'm going to tear the curtain down, he said. No more silence. No more middlemen. No more layers between the truth and the people. He turned back to the desk, picked up the tablet, and tapped open a new message. To Board of Directors. Subject policy breach and executive review. He didn't dictate to Kendrick. He wrote it himself, one key at a time. Because this wasn't damage control anymore. This was a declaration.
They had taken his name and used it to lock the very doors he'd once kicked open.
Now he'd make sure those doors didn't just open again. They'd never close. Shaq pulled into the driveway of a modest brick home, one he'd offered to rebuild a dozen times, and each time Lucille had waved him off. This house raised giants just fine the way it is, she'd said. And now as he climbed the porch steps, the same screen door with the crooked frame creaked open like it always did, before she even reached it. Lucille O'Neill stood in the doorway with a dish towel in one hand and her reading glasses in the other. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back, her posture straight, her presence unwavering. Your face tells me you didn't come just for the cobbler, she said, stepping aside. I'll take both. Shaq replied, his voice lower than usual. She didn't press. She never did. That was Lucille's gift. She could see through him without stepping on him. As he stepped inside, the scent of nutmeg and roasted pecans wrapped around him like a warm memory. The living room hadn't changed. Same photos, same soft tan couch, same wooden cross nailed above the hallway arch. Lucille sat first. Shaq lowered himself onto the couch across from her. His knees made the couch groan under his weight. But she didn't flinch. Bank business? She asked. Shaq nodded. Worse than I thought. You want to talk about it? I'm not sure it'll help. She folded the towel over her knee. Maybe. But talking's cheaper than therapy, and we've both got time. He breathed in deeply, then let it out slow. They used me, Ma. Used my name to sell something they never believed in. I thought I was helping build a system that could change lives. Turns out I was the face while they handled the rot behind the curtain. Lucille leaned forward, elbows on her thighs. Her eyes didn't blink. You surprised? I didn't want to be. Son, when you walked onto your first court, how many people hoped you'd be more than just tall? He didn't answer. And when you left that court, how many people hoped you'd be quiet about what you saw? Still, no answer. You thought this would be different? She asked, her voice gentle, but unyielding. That they'd suddenly stop playing games just because your face was on the door. Shaq looked down at his hands. Large, strong, but today they felt empty. I should have seen it, he muttered. I should have known. Lucille sat back and reached for a framed photo on the side table. She held it up. It was worn at the corners. In the photo, a young Shaq stood in torn sneakers, smiling wide, arm around a boy in a ripped t-shirt. You remember this? She asked. He nodded. Yeah, that was at Kennedy Park. He hated me, called me names all the time. Lucille smiled faintly. And yet you gave him your sneakers. He had holes in his, Shaq said. Didn't seem right to keep mine when I had another pair at home. She placed the photo back down. You knew how to heal before you knew how to dunk. She said, that's always been your way. Not with speeches, with acts. That's why they needed you on the brochures. That spirit, that trust. They can't fake that, so they borrowed it. But it still belongs to you. Shaq closed his eyes.
I'm tired, Ma.
You should be. Carrying people is exhausting. Carrying their expectations is worse. But that doesn't mean you stop. It just means you rest. Then you move different. He opened his eyes and met hers. I don't know how to move now. Do I fix it? Burn it? Start over? Lucille tilted her head. You already know the answer. That's why you came home. You didn't come for advice. You came for permission. He looked at her. To do what? To be who you were before they dressed you up, she said. You want to rip down what's rotten? Then do it. But not for revenge. Do it so the next Jerome Reed doesn't have to wear a disguise just to be treated like a man. Silence fell between them. Thick but sacred. Lucille stood, walked into the kitchen, and returned with a bowl of warm peach cobbler. She placed it in front of him, along with a spoon. Shaq took it, smiling faintly. She sat again, hands folded in her lap. You raised a good one, he said quietly. Lucille raised her brow. Damn right I did. They sat in peace for a while. No headlines. No boardrooms. Just gospel truth in a room that didn't need validation. As he finished the cobbler, Shaq's shoulders eased. Not because the problems were solved, but because he'd found the part of himself that hadn't been touched by betrayal. The part that still believed. The part that gave away shoes to boys who didn't deserve them. Not because they were kind, but because they were hurting. That part of him wasn't gone. It had just been buried. Now it was ready to lead again. The podium wasn't made for spectacle. It wasn't draped in banners or wrapped in the seal of a Fortune 500 company. It stood on cracked pavement outside the same bank branch that had once denied Shaq a loan. This time, though, there were no locked doors, no security guards sizing him up, just folding chairs packed with families, community leaders, small business owners, and teens in oversized sweatshirts, all gathered under a blue sky with the scent of city soil and summer heat in the air. Shaq adjusted the mic, not out of nerves, but to buy a moment. He wasn't here to perform. No teleprompters, no PR team hovering behind him, just truth. Raw, deliberate, overdue. I'm not here as your CEO, he began, his voice steady but low. I'm here as a man who got played in his own house. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but he didn't pause. For years, I let my name be used to sell a promise. Equity, opportunity, respect. I believed we were building something real. But the truth is, behind those glass walls, the people who claimed to be my partners were building something else. A gate, one I didn't even see, until it was shut in my face. He let that hang in the air. I walked into this branch not long ago under a different name. Same history, same credit, same blood running through my veins. And they turned me away. Not because of policy, because of perception, because I didn't come wrapped in power. He scanned the crowd, no cameras flashing, no applause, just eyes locked in. But this isn't about me, he said. This is about all the people who never had a second name to fall back on, who didn't have money to test the system, who walked into this place and walked out believing they weren't enough, that their zip code decided their worth, that their skin tone wrote their financial story before they did. He stepped back from the mic, raised a hand, pointed behind him. This building is no longer a bank. A gasp moved through the crowd. It's now the Shaquille O'Neal Center for Financial Empowerment. Free programs, real mentors, classes on budgeting, credit, entrepreneurship, open to anyone who's been denied a shot. Somewhere in the back, a teenage boy whispered, "No way." Shaq turned again, voice growing stronger. And I'm not stopping there. Today I'm launching the RE White Fund. It's a grant program for small business owners who were denied loans because of systemic bias. If you've got the plan, we'll back the hustle. No suits required. No polished pitches. Just proof that you're trying to build. People started standing now, not for applause but because the air itself had changed. The weight of history shifting in real time. And finally, he said, his voice colder now, calculated, I filed a civil suit against the executive leadership of O'Neal Financial Trust, not as an attack, but as exposure. I'm holding my own people accountable, because it's not enough to build something with your name if you won't burn it when it turns crooked. The crowd stilled. What he'd just said wasn't just bold, it was unthinkable. A man suing the empire he created. He let the shock breathe before finishing. This isn't about canceling anyone. It's about correcting everything. If I have to dismantle this structure brick by brick, I will. And when I rebuild it, it'll be in your image. Not mine. Not theirs. Yours. He stepped down from the podium. No entourage waiting. No SUV running. Just handshakes. Real ones. A woman in her 50s hugged him without asking. A boy in a school uniform gave him a folded note that simply read, My dad tried to get a loan here. They said no. He cried in his car. You made that matter. Shaq held the note tight in his palm, the ink bleeding slightly from the sweat in his grip. But it grounded him. The press didn't know what to do with the story. There were no sound bites packaged neatly, no brand consultant on hand to interpret the message. What they had was a titan of industry cracking open the armor of success and using the pieces to build ladders. That same week, 3 more branches were converted into literacy centers. The following month, the fund had backed 11 new businesses, barbershops, tech startups, food trucks, all run by men and women who had once been told they didn't have the right profile. Shaq didn't hold press conferences. He held community dinners. He sat with people at round tables, listened more than he talked, and reminded them, if they won't let you in the room, make a new one. The lawsuit sent shockwaves through Wall Street. Shareholders panicked. Board members resigned. But Shaq didn't blink. He welcomed the chaos. It meant the walls were finally coming down. He wasn't trying to save his company anymore. He was trying to redeem it. And that's a different kind of power. It doesn't glitter. It glows. Everyone had seen the headlines. The lawsuit. The community announcement. The press silence from HQ. And most importantly, the internal memo from Shaq himself. Emergency session. Mandatory. No delegates. The long mahogany table had seated some of the city's most influential minds, chief executives, operations heads, compliance veterans, faces with clout in the press, and roots in the market. But today they looked less like leaders and more like defendants waiting for a verdict. Except the judge in this room wasn't dressed in robes. He was wearing a charcoal gray blazer and no tie. Shaq entered alone. No Kendrick. No assistant. No legal team. Just Shaq. And when he stood at the head of the table, he didn't raise a folder, didn't tap a gavel. He just placed his hand flat against the surface and looked at every face in the room, one by one, slowly, without blinking. Then he began, "You all know what I've done, what I've said, what I've exposed." No one moved. The silence agreed with him. "But what you don't know is what I've learned. Not from lawyers, not from analysts. From truth. Cold and comfortable, naked truth." He took a breath, not to pace himself, but to signal that this wasn't performance. It was release. "I built this company because I believed we could outgrow what the world told us we had to be. I believed money didn't have to be blind. That banks could serve instead of exploit. That power could be shared instead of hoarded. I thought I was leading that mission." A few glances around the table. Some ashamed, some impatient. "I was wrong," he said, voice sharpening. "I wasn't leading. I was decorating. You let me smile in commercials while you rewrote the rules behind closed doors. I gave you my name, and you gave me your silence. You used me like perfume. Just enough to cover the stench." He paused. No one defended themselves. "Do you know what it feels like to walk into your own building and be treated like a threat? To hear a manager deny a loan based on a gut feeling? To watch a receptionist pretend not to see you because you didn't walk in with a suit or a status symbol?" He leaned forward. "I know what it feels like now, and I know how many others have felt it too. Because I've got their names. I've got the footage. I've got the files you tried to bury under bureaucracy." One of the executives, Harold Denslow, CFO, cleared his throat. "With respect, Shaquille, we didn't all agree with those decisions. Some of us tried to." Shaq cut him off without raising his voice.
Then where were you when policies changed, when the approval algorithms were skewed, when whistleblowers were bought out with NDA hush money and exit packages? Where were you?
Harold's mouth opened and closed like a man trying to explain a fire he didn't put out. Shaq stood straight again. "You weren't just silent. You were complicit." He reached into his coat and pulled out a single document. Laid it flat on the table. "This is my resignation." A sharp gasp snapped through the room. "I'm resigning from the version of this company that you've turned it into. I'm stepping down as your face, your mascot, your liability shield. But I'm not leaving the mission. I'm reclaiming it." Mouths moved, but words didn't come. One woman, a compliance director with trembling fingers, covered her mouth like she'd just witnessed a funeral. "This board is dissolved, effective immediately. The corporate structure that allowed this poison to spread will not be reformed. It will be replaced. You are no longer my counsel. You are no longer my board." Someone finally found their voice. Mel Whitman, Chief Risk Officer. "You can't just dismantle a governance body." "I just did," Shaq said calmly. Another voice from the far end. Rachel Monroe, Marketing Lead. "What happens to our shares? Our contracts? You're putting the company at risk." Shaq walked down the length of the table slowly, like a man checking locks before closing a chapter. "You're worried about contracts? I'm worried about kids who never get a business off the ground because they were born in the wrong zip code. You're worried about risk? I'm worried about the reality of what we've done. That reality has a cost, and we're paying it now." He reached the end of the table, turned around. "Anyone who wants to follow me into this new model, into something clean, transparent, community-led, you'll have to earn your place. Not with money, with conviction. Everyone else." He looked around once more. This is your exit. And then the most unexpected thing happened. One by one, without a word, executives began to stand and leave. First Rachel, then Harold, then 2 directors, a VP, and the HR chief. Each of them walked to the door slowly, like students excused from class they no longer understood. Some nodded as they passed. Some avoided his gaze, but none argued. By the time the door closed again, only 5 seats were filled. Shaq returned to the head of the table. To those still here, he said quietly, "This isn't a promotion. This is a test. We're starting from scratch. No titles, no egos, just the work. We build this company again, but this time the right way." The 5 remained silent, but resolute. Shaq sat down, and for the first time in a long time the table didn't feel heavy. It felt possible. The bridge to his past self was gone. But in the distance, something new had begun to rise. Not built on polish.
Built on truth.
The gold plaque outside read, "The Legacy Trust, Est by Shaquille O'Neal, rebuilt by the people." Inside, the floors were scuffed, not from wear, but from life. There were teens leaning over laptops in a corner lounge, an old man reading over mortgage options with a young counselor, and 2 women reviewing business plans at a shared community table. The place still offered financial services, but no one here was a number. They were seen. A boy, no older than 10, pushed the door open, holding it for his father behind him. The man was dressed in a utility jacket, paint on his forearm, boots worn at the heel. He looked around, cautious at first. His eyes flicked across the room, scanning for the sign of judgment he was used to. None came. A young man behind the welcome desk stood up with an easy smile. His name tag read, Eli Thompson, community banker. He walked around the counter instead of shouting across it, and crouched just slightly to meet the boy's height. "Welcome to Legacy. First time visiting us?" The father nodded. "Yeah, just looking to talk about savings." For him. Eli looked at the boy and extended a fist for a bump. "Well then, let's make sure your future's got a solid start." The boy grinned and bumped back. And somewhere behind the scenes, Shaq watched it unfold from the observation deck. Not hidden, just unseen for now. He leaned against the railing, hands folded in front of him, his eyes not on the father or the son, but on the space itself, on what it had become, what they had made it into. The past months had been a blur. Headlines, backlash, lawsuits, resignations, but none of that lingered here, not in this place, because this place wasn't built on press releases. It was built on pain, truth, and the audacity to start over with open hands instead of clenched fists. Legacy Trust wasn't a bank in the traditional sense anymore. It was a cooperative. Every employee held a stake. Every community initiative was shaped by the people it served. The board wasn't a cluster of executives in ivory towers. It was made up of teachers, barbers, nonprofit leaders, small business owners, real people, with real voices. When the press had asked Shaq if he was dismantling the empire he spent years building, his answer had been simple: "I'm turning it into something they can't buy out." The crowd didn't cheer then. They sat quiet, stunned. But now, months later, they understood. This wasn't about erasing what had been done. It was about rewriting who it had been done for. Kendrick walked up beside him, holding a tablet, but not pushing it forward yet. "They just launched the Youth Entrepreneur Program," Kendrick said. "Full enrollment. Waitlist already started. Local businesses offering mentorships. Some even opening internships. We didn't even push marketing." Shaq nodded, gaze steady. "And the Rewrite Fund. 16 new businesses funded. 3 have already turned a profit. Not a single default." One applicant said it felt like someone was finally betting on his dignity instead of his metrics. Shaq didn't smile, but his shoulders eased. "You did good, boss," Kendrick said. "I didn't do it alone," Shaq replied. He looked down again as the father and son sat with Eli at a desk in the corner, already engaged in a conversation that didn't feel like banking. It felt like building. "I used to think legacy was about trophies," Shaq said after a long silence. "Records. Buildings with your name. Now I see it different. Legacy's not what you leave behind. It's what you seed. What grows when you're not looking." Kendrick gave him the tablet. "Finally. You ready for your speech? City Hall's expecting you." Shaq took the tablet but didn't glance at the screen. "I'm not giving a speech," he said. "I'm telling a story." Kendrick smiled faintly. "You always do." Shaq walked back through the hall, through the renovated atrium, filled with photos of community members, instead of stock images. One frame held a small, handwritten note from a woman named Alicia Brooks. She was the single mother who'd been denied a loan 2 years ago. The same woman whose child had written the note Shaq carried in his wallet now. Her business, Brooks & Co. Creative Prints, had just landed a citywide contract for school supplies. Below the photo, her quote read, "They told me no." He turned it into a yes that changed everything. Shaq stopped for just a second to take it in. Then he continued to the exit. Outside, the late afternoon light wrapped around the building like a blessing. A group of teens stood near a muralist painting the final strokes of a new piece on the side wall. It showed an open vault, but instead of cash or gold, it held something else. Books, hearts, and hands reaching upward. At the top, painted in bold lettering, "Not alone, a legacy." And in that moment, as Shaq stood under that sky, the city moved around him, but didn't distract him. He could hear the laughter of a little girl, learning to count change at a literacy booth inside. He could smell street vendors preparing for the block party. Legacy Trust had started sponsoring monthly, and he could feel something settling inside him. Something he hadn't felt in years. Peace, not because the work was done, but because it was finally right. As the scene pulled wide, the final narration echoed, not through speakers, but within the hearts of those watching, listening, feeling. They thought I came for a loan, but I came for something no vault could hold. Justice. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or locked out of something you helped build, this story is yours too. What started as one man's quiet stand became a blueprint for louder justice. Because real change doesn't wait for permission. It walks in unannounced. Stay connected. Stay watching. The next door that opens might just be yours.